So, over time, the Holy Roman Empire was various states, sometimes ranging into the thousands or more, and all of these small principalities were constantly struggling against one another to become the emperor. This area was an electoral monarchy, and basically what that meant was the prince in a certain area had to have the majority of the princes in the empire, who were elector princes, back him for his run for emperor. You were emperor until you died, and then there was a new election, and then there was a new emperor. The system played out for several hundred years before it sort of was found out and became more of an inheritance and less of an actual election. But we're going to look a little bit at why that happened and how the switchover occurred. So, Austria, Bohemia, and a few other major players were all competing for the title of emperor. Up in the 14th century, Bohemia actually had a pretty good run with it, but they were always sort of seen as outsiders. They spoke a little bit different language, and they weren't culturally contiguous with most of the Holy Roman Empire. So even though they were electors in that body, their rule always felt a bit foreign. Austria and Bohemia bordered each other, and the idea of going to war would have been tempting, except the Austrians knew they didn't have a safe southern border, and the Bohemians did. So the chances of war were low, and the chances of Bohemian victory, at least initially, would have been high. A great Austrian leader named Frederick secured a place on the throne through shrewd diplomacy, but also through good patronage. Now, patronage is an idea that's sort of been thrown to the wayside in modern times. Artists used to look for patrons who were rich and powerful and influential people who would support them, and a good patron allowed the arts to flower under him in a way that showed his dignity and his cultus and his authoritas. All of those old Roman ideas that we talked about really started to come back with the Renaissance. So if you were a leader and you wanted to look good, you could say, for your people, one way to do that would be to bring them great art. But here's the thing, if you are a patron and you look for an artist and you don't fully agree with him and his views, it could be easy to try and silence or stifle him. The thing is, that didn't actually happen as much as we'd like to believe. Galileo is a great example here. He was supported by several popes and by the school of Jesuits. They gave him enough money to make sure that his messages and his ideas would be spread. And at a certain point, he decided to write a book on how much that pope that gave him all that money was an asshole, which is okay. The only problem with that is they got into a power struggle with each other, and his art was allowed to continue, but it sort of looked bad on both sides, and the concept of the two being together sort of began to fall to the wayside. A lot of other nations sort of addressed this a little bit better. Galileo's ideas weren't, like I said, they weren't really stifled in any way. When he was being messed with by the authorities, it was because he was taking money from them to use on projects that defamed them, which was something he probably could have done on his own time. But we're looking at Austria, right? And Austria had a flowering in the humanist movement right after the Renaissance in Italy. The Northern Renaissance occurred very similar time, and this was one of the first times where Austria decided that they weren't going to be warlike or expanding their influence aggressively. They were going to try to flower into a cultural capital. There was other cultural capitals in Italy and France, but there wasn't really one concentrated one in Central Europe quite yet. Austria took up this mantle, they would invite hundreds of people to these large parties. They had dances, they had music. When we look at France, we really look at their painting. And when we look at England, we really look at their writing. There's not a lot of nations like Austria that were so devoted to so many different cultural media that it seemed more like a focus. It always seemed more like an afterthought in a lot of the Western European countries that were really more focused on warfare. In this time, and with the Austrian people, we see a lot more in the humanist flowering, we see a lot more in ideas, and as time ground on and hard decisions came to be made, they decided against ideas like colonization, they decided against ideas that seemed to benefit their people even though they would not benefit some others. So Austria had a lot of hard calls to make and generally went with the idea that if people wanted to be Austrian, then Austria would flourish. So people should want to be Austrian. To get a little better look at Austria at this time, let's do another thought experiment. This time, let's say you are the astute Maximilian, and your father is Frederick, the Holy Roman Emperor. He's elderly now, and he's been getting sick. Your whole life has been spent at various courts across Europe, meeting new people, new cultures, learning new languages, learning how to integrate all of the new information in the various peoples which would be important to an emperor. He becomes sick and eventually dies, and a new election is held for the Holy Roman Empire. The elector princes had an affinity with your father, and many of them have close allies with Austria, who did everything that it could in its past to make any diplomatic niceties available and to offend as little as possible. The election is held, the votes are tallied, and it is decided that you will become Maximilian I, the Holy Roman Emperor. Congratulations! How do you expand? This is a time when new lands meant new wealth, and the idea of excessive trade hadn't really come to be that popular quite yet. The war with Burgundy had left them missing a duke, and as such, their closest relation was actually the Hapsburg line, so you now have Burgundy and the Low Countries. This might seem like a great opportunity, but these lands are far away and are going to be very hard to manage, especially with very little naval presence. On the other hand, the Swiss in the Alps have confederated and pushed your lands out, so now there is no connection between your eastern provinces and your western ones. This makes communication and administration much more difficult. If only there was some way to split the empire in two and have two separate administrations, it would be much more efficient, and you could properly hold on to the lands without possibly agitating any of the local populations. So, in addition to these problems, you also have the Low Countries, which have been passed so many times that they're starting to get tired of it, and your own nobles at home plot every time you leave castle. So, you need to be able to balance the influences of your people, your nobles, your foreign lands, and the foreign dignitaries, all without getting wrapped up in any silly wars so that you can defend yourself if you need to. Are you up to the task? With the military out, you have a few options open and available to you, those being marriage, diplomacy, and mass appeal. You are the great Maximilian, and you decide to employ all of these routes to a safer and more stable society. So, first, you decide to expand to make up for the losses in the Swiss Confederation through shrewd negotiations and politicking and a lot of trade envoys. You secure marriage between your son and the future Queen of Castile. He will go on to be the King of Spain, and the west of the Hapsburg Empire will be secured. But that's not enough. You want to go one step further. Because the Low Countries can't really be accessed by the eastern Habsburg lands, you want the western ones to be able to go after it. And because administration isn't the greatest at this point, you decide to break the Habsburg lands up into two: the Spanish Habsburg and the Austrian Habsburg. The Spanish will take control of the Low Countries since they have ships that can sail there, and since the Low Countries mostly trade with Italy and Spain anyways. It makes a lot of sense, and the people have already been integrated over time. This would come to be sort of a disaster, but much less for Austria Habsburg than for the Spanish Habsburgs, who would lose the Netherlands to the United Provinces, which would really just become another trading partner anyways. The next step with your diplomacy is going to take a couple of ideas to implement. The first one we're going to look at would be decasselation. So any castles that aren't necessary and that aren't run by the military need to be torn down. There's a couple reasons for this. One, with the new cannons coming in, a castle and the maintenance that goes into that castle becomes sort of a headache. You don't want to pay all of this money in the stone repairs and in the fortifications and in the armory and in all of the other things that really makes a castle a very expensive project if a cannon's just going to come in and knock it down, or if a lord is just going to hold himself up there and rebel against you. Castles will need to be deconstructed into new forts or removed altogether, which is the uprooting of houses and noble families. Nobles at this time were still very much attached to the idea that they could be lords over small areas, but this presents an administrative and a legal quagmire, if you will. It's much harder to administer 300 towns with 300 people than it is to have one sort of central authority, and at this time it became much more possible for a central city like Vienna to administer to the rest of the country. So you needed to get these roadblocks out of the way so that the emperor and his armies could freely march through their own lands. The military will also need to be reworked. Until now, the nobles ruled the military, and a lot of their nobility actually came from them fighting and dying on the front lines. Because of new mass armies, because of new pikes and guns in the pike and shot formation, which we will take a look at some other point. I'm probably going to do a military history as well. These new armies began to march with many more of the local people and the people that actually made up the empire. This made military swell, and it also made the nobles much less valuable. One guy with a gun can very easily take down a rich guy on a horse with very expensive armor. In fact, at the time, it was much worse to be wearing armor if you got shot by a musket or a blunderbuss, because it didn't have enough power to break through the armor twice, but it did have enough power to break through the armor once. What does that mean? You're wearing a suit of armor, you get shot, the bullet enters the armor, can't go out, and it just sort of bangs around, turning your insides into a noble soup, if you will. This meant that the indispensable nature that allowed the nobles to be rebellious and to demand rights and favors and privileges from the emperor began to evaporate, as the knights on the field were no longer necessary for winning mass battles. So the nobility has been put in check. The negotiations for new lands in what will become Habsburg Spain have been laid. You have one more goal. The people that are going to build your army, and that are the legs of your nation, need to be awed. They need to understand that you are a wise and competent leader that wants the best for them. What's the best way to do this? Some form of mass appeal. At the time, you could have decided to be a patron, and you did. You look around for local artists who have an eye for things that's a little bit different from other people. The intention to bring new ideas and new concepts to even the lowest of peasants and workers in your nation. You scour the lands, finally finding new concept of humanism. The humanists are people that focus on human emotion and average scenes that display people and some figures in a story that isn't generally told, at least at that time. These new humanists decide to paint not only the royal family, but religious scenes, local scenes, customs, and they bring their own flair to the Austrian people. No longer will pilgrimages to Italy be required to see great works of art. Your people will see them in their own homes with their own authenticity. This is very important because if your painters can't really be told apart from other painters, then how do they know that this was something that you brought back for them anyways? In your new territory, the Low Countries, there's a great painter. His name is Peter Paul Rubens. He paints fantastic images, and your main opponent, France, has a very similar painting culture. You commission Peter Paul Rubens not only to bring great works to your people, but also to forge closer ties with the French and with other nations on the continent. After all, one nation can't be a continent alone. Alright guys, thank you very much for watching. Thanks to all my subscribers. There's a lot of you already, and it's grown better than I thought it would, to be honest, so I just wanted to say thank you. You guys really give me the push that I need to keep putting these out, and I do enjoy this a lot, but sometimes kind of get in a rut, so it's nice to look down and see that that's growing. This is the last episode in the first season of How Art Met the Future. The next season's coming out next Tuesday. There's not going to be a delay or anything, but we're going to be going back through the cycle again, starting with the ancient Bronze Age and looking at the way that art developed this time, now that we have sort of a basic foundation. We're going to be looking at some different concepts, and it's going to be a little bit different, but it'll be basically the same thing. I did this episode with a new format, so if you liked it, let me know. If you didn't, let me know what you didn't like. If you have any comments or questions, please feel free to leave them below. And I hope that you enjoyed. I hope to see you again. Remember, we have new episodes of On the Silk Road on Sundays and new episodes of How Art Met the Future on Tuesdays. Hope to see you again soon. Until then, remember, Ave Imperator.